The Intergalactic Combat Academy on Nexus Prime operated on a simple principle that would make Charles Darwin weep with pride. The strong survived, the weak became cautionary tales, and everyone else fell somewhere in between while pretending they weren't terrified of ending up as the latter. It was a magnificent testament to galactic civilization's ability to take the worst aspects of high school and weaponize them across 17 star systems. Built into the crystalline cliffs of Nexus Prime's northern continent, the Academy resembled what might happen if someone gave a military architect unlimited funding and a severe complex about compensating for something. Towers of gleaming metal and force field windows stretched toward the purple sky, each level dedicated to proving that violence, when properly organized and bureaucratized, could indeed solve most interpersonal conflicts. The Academy's hierarchy followed a refreshingly honest approach to species classification. At the pinnacle sat the Galvakians, 7-foot behemoths whose evolutionary path had apparently involved wrestling asteroid miners for fun. Their bone density could deflect small arms fire, their muscle mass required specialized furniture, and their casual handshakes had hospitalized 3 different ambassadors during the Academy's opening ceremonies. Below them, in descending order of perceived lethality, came the Zephyrians with their razor-sharp exoskeletons, the Thakari with their redundant organ systems, and so forth down the biological food chain. Humans occupied the rather inglorious position of second from bottom, just above the Polarians, who were essentially sentient jellyfish with anxiety disorders. This ranking had been determined through rigorous scientific analysis, which is to say someone had looked at human bone density charts, laughed until their gills hurt, and filed the paperwork accordingly. The Academy's philosophy could be summarized thusly: if you couldn't bench press a small spacecraft, you had no business learning how to disable one with your bare hands. It was a worldview that had served the institution well for 3 centuries, producing graduates who could end political negotiations with a firm handshake and settle territorial disputes through interpretive violence. Leading the charge in this educational paradise was Instructor Vex'tar, a Galvakian whose impressive credentials included 17 years of active combat, 43 confirmed eliminations, and a teaching style that made drill sergeants weep with admiration. Vex'tar stood nearly 8 feet in his ceremonial boots, possessed biceps that required their own postal codes, and maintained a professional demeanor that suggested he viewed physical education as a contact sport where contact was mandatory and sport was optional. His specialty course, euphemistically titled Fragility Assessment and Combat Readiness Evaluation, served as the Academy's primary method of separating the wheat from the chaff, assuming wheat could bench press freight containers and chaff tended to require medical attention after handshake demonstrations. The course had a graduation rate that would make actuaries nervous and a casualty rate that kept the medical wing profitable. Into this den of sanctioned brutality walked Corporal Riley Chen, humanity's latest offering to the Academy's ongoing experiment in interspecies character building. At 5'6" and possessing what generous observers might call an economical build, Riley represented everything the Academy's hierarchy held in polite contempt. Her personnel file read like a medical textbook's chapter on structural inadequacy: bone density 40% below Galvakian standards, muscle mass insufficient for regulation equipment loads, and reflexes that barely registered on testing equipment calibrated for superior species. She moved through the Academy's halls with the unassuming presence of someone who had learned that attracting attention usually involved paperwork she'd rather avoid. Her uniform fit properly without requiring custom tailoring. Her equipment weighed exactly what the specifications claimed it should, and her physical presence failed to set off the proximity alarms that taller students routinely triggered. In an institution dedicated to the celebration of physical superiority, Riley Chen achieved the remarkable feat of being functionally invisible. The other students treated her with a kind of casual dismissal reserved for furniture that served its purpose without being particularly noteworthy. Cadet Thruzak, a Zephyrian whose exoskeleton could deflect energy weapons, would step around her in corridors the same way he'd navigate around a maintenance cart. Lieutenant Griselda of the Thakari delegation offered polite nods that suggested she was acknowledging Riley's theoretical right to exist while remaining skeptical about the practical applications thereof. Riley observed these interactions with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying mating rituals in species she had no intention of joining. She attended lectures, participated in exercises, and maintained the kind of academic performance that suggested competence without inspiring curiosity. Her instructors filed reports describing her as adequate for species parameters and unlikely to require remedial intervention, which in academy terminology translated to probably won't die embarrassingly during graduation ceremonies. The academy's training regimen operated on the assumption that pain was educational, fear was motivational, and dignity was a luxury item available only to those strong enough to defend it. Morning exercises began before dawn and continued until someone required medical attention, at which point they continued for another hour to build character. Afternoon combat training involved scenarios where failure resulted in actual injury, because theoretical consequences failed to provide sufficient learning incentives. Evening lectures covered tactical theory, strategic planning, and advanced applications of violence as diplomatic tool, all delivered with a kind of academic rigor that transformed brutality into an art form. Through all of this, Riley maintained her unremarkable presence, completing assignments with workman-like efficiency and avoiding the kind of spectacular failures that typically marked human participation in academy programs. She lifted weights that were appropriately challenging for her species classification, ran distances that met minimum requirements without exceeding expectations, and demonstrated combat techniques with the mechanical precision of someone following instruction manuals rather than channeling warrior instincts. It was during the third week of Fragility assessment that Instructor Vex'tar's attention finally focused on Riley with the laser-like intensity of a predator who had spotted something that might provide amusing sport. The day's lesson involved demonstration of proper striking techniques, using volunteer students to illustrate the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application. Combat effectiveness, Vex'tar announced to the assembled class, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose opinions were backed by the ability to physically enforce them, requires understanding your own capabilities relative to your opponent's limitations. Superior species adapt their techniques to maximize impact against inferior opponents. He gestured toward Riley with the casual dismissiveness of someone selecting produce. Corporal Chen will assist with today's demonstration of physiological disadvantages in combat scenarios. The classroom fell silent with the kind of expectant hush that typically preceded either spectacular entertainment or tragic accidents. Riley stood and approached the demonstration area with the same unhurried pace she'd maintained for 3 weeks, her expression suggesting mild interest in the proceedings rather than concern about their potential outcome. Vex'tar circled her slowly, his massive frame making her appear even smaller by comparison. "Observe the fundamental weakness inherent in human construction," he began, his tone carrying the pedantic authority of someone delivering a lecture rather than a prelude to violence. Bone density insufficient for impact resistance. Muscle mass inadequate for force generation. Skeletal structure optimized for endurance rather than power output. He paused dramatically, allowing his audience to fully appreciate the disparity between his impressive physique and Riley's modest proportions. Human military doctrine compensates for these deficiencies through technological augmentation and numerical superiority. Remove those advantages, and you're left with a species whose primary survival strategy involves running away and hoping someone else deals with the problem. A few students laughed at this observation, the kind of polite chuckling that suggested appreciation for wit rather than genuine amusement. Riley stood motionlessly throughout this analysis, her hands clasped behind her back in a posture that suggested patience rather than submission. The human nervous system, Vex'tar continued, warming to his subject with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed his work, processes combat stimuli approximately 30% slower than Gorvakian standards. Their reaction times are sufficient for operating farming equipment and filing administrative paperwork, but entirely inadequate for serious combat applications. He stopped directly in front of Riley, close enough that his shadow completely engulfed her smaller frame. Their bone structure lacks the redundancy found in superior species. A single well-placed strike to key structural points can disable them completely, whereas a Gorvakian requires sustained assault to achieve similar results. Vex'tar raised his massive fist, holding it inches from Riley's face to illustrate his point. Human facial bones are particularly fragile. The jaw assembly can be completely disrupted with minimal force application. The nasal structure collapses under pressure that wouldn't inconvenience a Gorvakian child. The orbital bones surrounding their inadequate visual senses shatter like decorative glass. Riley's expression remained neutral throughout this anatomical lecture, though careful observers might have noticed a slight shift in her posture that suggested attention rather than resignation. Their muscle density prevents them from generating sufficient force to threaten superior opponents, Vex'tar continued, his voice taking on the mocking tone of someone thoroughly enjoying his intellectual superiority. Human striking power peaks at levels that most Academy species would classify as vigorous handshakes. Their combat techniques rely on leverage and momentum to compensate for their fundamental weakness, but these tactics become irrelevant when facing opponents who can simply absorb their attacks without meaningful damage. He stepped back slightly, his arms spread wide in a gesture that encompassed the entire demonstration. This is why humans require mechanical augmentation to participate in serious military operations. Without powered armor, energy weapons, and numerical superiority, they become liability rather than asset in combat situations. The class murmured appreciatively at this comprehensive analysis. Several students took notes, apparently finding educational value in the systematic deconstruction of human combat capabilities. Riley continued standing motionlessly, though her weight had shifted almost imperceptibly forward, and her breathing had become precisely regulated in a way that suggested controlled preparation rather than resigned acceptance. Of course, Vex'tar concluded with the satisfied air of someone delivering a particularly crushing final observation. Their greatest weakness isn't physical inadequacy. It's their psychological fragility. Humans possess emotional responses that compromise their tactical judgment. They become attached to concepts like fairness, proportional response, and minimizing collateral damage. These limitations make them predictable and exploitable in combat scenarios. He leaned down slightly, bringing his massive head closer to Riley's level. They are simply too soft for the realities of serious warfare, too concerned with appearing civilized to embrace the brutality that victory requires. Riley looked up at him with mild interest, as if he'd been explaining agricultural techniques rather than systematically dismantling her species' military credibility. "Instructor Kolos," she said quietly, her voice carrying no trace of anger or offense, "would you like me to demonstrate human combat techniques for the class?" Vex'tar's laugh boomed through the classroom like artillery fire. "By all means, Corporal. Show us these legendary human martial skills that require technological augmentation to achieve basic effectiveness." Riley nodded politely and took a single step backward, creating enough space for what followed to be clearly observed by the entire class. Her movement was economical, precise, and utterly without wasted motion. Her right foot shifted slightly, distributing her weight in a way that suggested preparation rather than retreat. Her hands remained at her sides, relaxed but positioned with the kind of casual readiness that spoke of muscle memory rather than conscious planning. "Human combat doctrine," she said conversationally, as if delivering a lecture rather than preparing for violence, emphasizes efficiency over intimidation. We don't possess the physical advantages that allow for prolonged engagements, so our techniques focus on ending conflicts quickly and decisively. Vex'tar's expression suggested he was already composing the amusing anecdote he'd share with his colleagues about the time a human attempted to lecture him about combat effectiveness. He raised his arms in an exaggerated fighting stance, his massive fists positioned to demonstrate the proper way to address human pretensions to martial competence. "The key principle," Riley continued in the same calm tone, "is targeting structural vulnerabilities rather than attempting to match strength against strength. Superior species often develop combat techniques that rely on their physical advantages, which can create predictable patterns and defensive gaps." She moved forward with the same unhurried pace she'd maintained throughout the academy, closing the distance between herself and Vex'tar with steps that suggested casual approach rather than aggressive advance. Her movement was so unthreatening that several students later admitted they'd assumed she was simply positioning herself for better instructional visibility. "For example," Riley said, and struck. The punch traveled approximately 18 inches, beginning from a position near her right hip and ending at the precise intersection of Vex'tar's jaw and temporal bone. Her fist moved with the kind of technical precision that engineers appreciate in well-designed machinery. No wasted energy, no unnecessary flourishes, just efficient transfer of kinetic force applied at the optimal angle to achieve maximum structural disruption. The sound of Vex'tar's jaw breaking was distinctly audible throughout the classroom, a sharp crack that suggested expensive things being damaged beyond reasonable repair. His massive frame, which had dominated the space with intimidating presence, suddenly folded in ways that defied architectural principles, as if someone had removed a crucial support beam from an otherwise impressive structure. He fell backward with the theatrical grandeur of a monument being toppled, his impressive bulk striking the floor with an impact that registered on seismic monitoring equipment 3 floors below. His jaw hung at an angle that suggested immediate orthodontic intervention would be advisable, and his eyes held the glazed expression of someone whose world had just been fundamentally reorganized without consulting him about the new arrangements. The classroom fell silent with the kind of profound quiet that typically follows natural disasters or significant theological revelations. 37 students representing 12 different species stared at the scene with expressions suggesting they were witnessing something that their educational background had failed to prepare them for. Several took notes with the mechanical efficiency of individuals whose minds had temporarily suspended critical thinking in favor of data collection. Riley examined her fist with mild interest, flexing her fingers to ensure proper functionality. The human hand contains 27 bones arranged in a configuration that allows for precise force application, she explained to the stunned audience, her tone maintaining the same conversational quality she'd used throughout the demonstration. Proper technique channels kinetic energy through the metacarpals and into the target while minimizing damage to the striker. She gestured toward Vex'tar, who was producing sounds that suggested his vocal apparatus was experiencing coordination difficulties with his newly reconfigured facial structure. Gorvakian jaw construction prioritizes bite force over impact resistance. The temporomandibular joint can be disrupted with approximately 400 pounds of precisely applied pressure, which is well within human striking capability when proper technique is employed. Medical personnel arrived with a kind of rushed efficiency that suggested they'd been monitoring the classroom's audio feeds for exactly this type of educational emergency. They deployed portable medical equipment with practiced expertise, their movements suggesting this wasn't their first experience with instructional casualties. Vex'tar was loaded onto a gravity stretcher, while making sounds that might have been attempts at communication or possibly just involuntary responses to his circulatory system's attempts to cope with architectural changes. Instructor Colos will require surgical reconstruction of his mandibular assembly, Riley noted helpfully as the medical team prepared for transport. The fracture pattern suggests approximately 6 weeks of liquid nutrition during recovery, followed by several months of physical therapy to restore proper jaw function. Dr. Kirithal, the Academy's chief medical officer and a Zephyrian whose professional competence was matched only by a talent for stating obvious things with scientific authority, examined her scanner readings with expressions that suggested professional curiosity warring with administrative concern. The strike achieved complete structural failure with surgical precision, she announced to no one in particular. The damage pattern suggests the human calculated force application, target vulnerability, and optimal impact angle with remarkable accuracy. Riley nodded politely at this assessment. Human military training emphasizes anatomical study and target analysis. We're required to understand the physiological characteristics of all species we're likely to encounter in combat situations. The medical team departed with their burden, leaving behind a classroom full of students whose worldview had just been subjected to percussive maintenance. The silence stretched until Cadet Thruzak, whose exoskeleton had deflected energy weapons during 3 separate military campaigns, raised his hand with the uncertain gesture of someone asking questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. Corporal Chen, he began carefully, what exactly is your military background? Riley straightened slightly, her posture shifting into something that suggested professional bearing rather than casual availability. Special Operations Command, 10th Strike Division. 15 years active service, specialized in close-quarters combat and high-value target elimination. I hold certifications in 43 different martial arts systems and have completed advanced training in anatomical disruption techniques for 17 species. The classroom's silence deepened, acquiring the quality of vacuum that suggested sound waves were having difficulty finding purchase in an environment where fundamental assumptions about reality had been recently invalidated. My assignment to the Academy, Riley continued with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reading from technical specifications, is part of an exchange program designed to evaluate human integration into galactic military command structures. The selection criteria emphasized operatives who could demonstrate human combat capabilities without requiring technological augmentation. Lieutenant Griselda of the Thakari delegation, whose redundant organ systems had allowed her to survive direct artillery hits during the Proxima campaigns, spoke with the careful precision of someone testing dangerous hypotheses. Are all humans capable of similar combat performance? Riley considered this question with the thoughtful attention of someone providing accurate intelligence rather than boasting about personal achievements. Human military forces maintain approximately 40 million active personnel trained to similar standards. Our Special Operations divisions include roughly 2 million individuals with advanced combat certifications. These numbers don't include civilian martial arts practitioners or law enforcement personnel with tactical training. She paused, apparently ensuring accuracy in her statistical reporting. Current human military doctrine assumes our forces will engage superior species using coordinated tactics and technological advantages. However, individual operatives are trained to function effectively without equipment support when circumstances require improvised solutions. The implications of this information settled over the classroom like toxic fog, gradually poisoning previously comfortable assumptions about galactic military hierarchies. Several students began calculating force ratios and deployment scenarios with expressions suggesting their previous strategic planning might require fundamental revision. The Academy's species classification system, Riley noted with diplomatic precision, appears to emphasize raw physical capabilities over tactical effectiveness. This approach provides useful baseline data, but may not accurately predict combat outcomes in realistic scenarios. Dr. Kirithal returned to collect her medical equipment, her movements suggesting professional efficiency constrained by administrative curiosity. "Corporal Chen," she said, "would you be available for physiological evaluation? Our baseline human data may require updating." Riley nodded agreeably. "Certainly, Doctor. Should I mention that standard human military enhancement protocols include bone density augmentation, muscle fiber optimization, and neural response acceleration? The Academy's human specimen data may reflect civilian rather than military populations." The medical officer's scanner slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor with sounds that suggested expensive diagnostic equipment experiencing unscheduled contact with reality. She retrieved it with movements that implied her professional confidence was undergoing emergency recalibration. Enhancement protocols. Dr. Kirithal's voice carried the strained quality of someone whose expertise was being systematically deconstructed by incoming information. "What parameters are we discussing?" Riley consulted her personal datapad with the casual efficiency of someone accessing routine information. Standard military augmentation increases bone density by approximately 60%, enhances muscle fiber efficiency by 40%, and accelerates neural transmission by 25%. These modifications are considered basic requirements for frontline personnel. She looked up from her data with expression that suggested helpful clarification rather than tactical intelligence briefing. Enhanced personnel represent roughly 30% of human military forces. Elite units maintain augmentation levels that approach 100% improvement across all physical parameters. The classroom's silence achieved new depths of profundity, suggesting that vacuum had been replaced by some exotic state of matter that absorbed sound, light, and possibly hope. Students who had spent 3 weeks confidently categorizing human capabilities according to Academy hierarchies stared at Riley with expressions suggesting their educational framework was experiencing catastrophic structural failure. The instructor was correct about human psychological characteristics. Riley continued in the same helpful tone. "We do prefer proportional response and minimizing collateral damage. These preferences guide our tactical doctrines and strategic planning." She gestured toward the bloodstain where Vex'tar had recently occupied classroom real estate. However, these preferences don't represent limitations when dealing with direct threats. Human military psychology emphasizes overwhelming response to eliminate threats quickly rather than prolonging conflicts through graduated escalation. Cadet Morthak, a Gorvakian whose physical specifications matched his species' impressive standards, raised his massive hand with movements that suggested uncertainty about questioning someone who had recently demonstrated practical applications of theoretical knowledge on a member of his own species. "Corporal," he began with diplomatic caution, Does this mean human military capabilities have been systematically underestimated by Academy assessment protocols? Riley considered this question with the careful attention of someone ensuring accuracy in official communications. The Academy's assessment appears to have evaluated human civilian populations rather than military personnel. This approach would be equivalent to judging Gorvakian combat effectiveness based on their agricultural workers rather than their warrior castes. She paused, apparently ensuring completeness in her response. Additionally, human military doctrine emphasizes deception and misdirection as tactical advantages. Appearing weaker than actual capabilities allows for strategic surprise and enemy overconfidence, both of which create exploitable advantages in combat scenarios. The implications of this revelation rippled through the classroom like seismic activity, causing previously stable assumptions to crack and shift in ways that suggested immediate architectural review might be advisable. Students began re-evaluating every interaction they'd had with Riley, searching for signs they'd missed while operating under Academy-approved misconceptions about human capabilities. Furthermore, Riley added with the helpful tone of someone providing complete intelligence briefings, human technological advancement has focused on force multiplication and tactical efficiency rather than individual physical enhancement. Our equipment is designed to allow smaller forces to engage larger opponents with superior effectiveness ratios. Dr. Kirithal, whose professional composure had been steadily eroding under the weight of incoming information, made notes with movements that suggested her previous medical assessments might require comprehensive revision. "What force multiplication factors are we discussing?" she asked with the careful precision of someone requesting technical specifications rather than casual conversation. Riley consulted her data pad again, apparently accessing routine technical information. Standard human infantry equipment provides approximately 10-to-1 force multiplication over unaugmented baseline. Elite units employ systems that achieve ratios approaching 50-to-1 under optimal conditions. The medical officer's pen stopped moving, suggesting her note-taking process had encountered insurmountable obstacles. 50-to-1 multiplication ratios. Riley nodded with confirmation that implied routine technical facts rather than classified military secrets. Human-powered armor systems integrate AI-assisted targeting, automated defensive systems, and weapons platforms capable of engaging multiple targets simultaneously. A single enhanced operative can establish tactical control over areas requiring company-level forces from unaugmented species. The classroom's educational environment was undergoing rapid transformation from confident instruction to emergency damage assessment. Students whose previous academic performance had been based on comfortable assumptions about species hierarchies stared at Riley with expressions suggesting their educational foundation was experiencing liquefaction. These capabilities explain human performance in recent galactic conflicts. Riley continued with historical analysis that transformed previous military assessments from accurate intelligence to dangerous misinformation. Human forces have maintained tactical superiority despite numerical disadvantages through superior equipment integration and strategic planning. Lieutenant Griselda's redundant organ systems, which had allowed survival during multiple combat engagements, seemed insufficient to process the implications of information that suggested her previous combat experience might have been fundamentally different with human opposition. "Corporal Chen," she said with diplomatic precision that masked growing tactical concern, "are you suggesting that human military forces have been deliberately concealing their actual capabilities during galactic military cooperation exercises?" Riley's expression suggested mild surprise that this conclusion hadn't been immediately obvious. Standard operational security requires maintaining tactical advantages through information control. Revealing actual capabilities during training exercises would eliminate strategic surprise in potential conflict scenarios. She paused, apparently ensuring accuracy in her intelligence assessment. Additionally, human military doctrine assumes that allies today might become opponents tomorrow. Comprehensive capability disclosure would violate basic strategic planning principles. The educational environment had achieved complete transformation from instructional facility to intelligence briefing center, with students frantically taking notes that would undoubtedly require immediate transmission to their respective military commands. The Academy's comfortable hierarchy had been replaced by urgent reassessment of galactic power structures. Dr. Kirithal gathered her equipment with movements that suggested professional duties were competing with strategic intelligence requirements. Corporal, I believe the Academy administration will want to discuss curriculum adjustments with you. Riley nodded agreeably, her demeanor suggesting routine academic consultation rather than fundamental revision of institutional policies. Certainly, Doctor. Should I prepare briefing materials on human military organization, tactical doctrines, and technology integration? The Academy's current curriculum appears to contain several areas where updated information might improve educational accuracy. The medical officer departed with haste that suggested her immediate priorities had shifted from routine medical duties to urgent administrative communications. The classroom settled into contemplative silence, with students processing information that required comprehensive revision of their strategic worldviews. Through the Academy's crystalline windows, Nexus Prime's purple sky maintained its serene beauty, apparently unaffected by the educational revolution occurring within the institution's walls. The Academy's towers continued reaching toward the heavens with architectural confidence, though their symbolic representation of galactic hierarchy might require reinterpretation in light of recent instructional developments. Riley gathered her materials with the same efficient movements she'd maintained throughout her Academy attendance, apparently considering the day's educational objectives successfully completed. Her demonstration had achieved comprehensive coverage of human combat capabilities, tactical doctrines, and strategic planning principles, though perhaps not through traditional instructional methodologies. Class dismissed, she announced to the stunned audience, apparently accepting temporary instructional authority in Vex'tar's medically necessitated absence. Students departed with expressions suggesting their immediate priorities included urgent communications with their respective military commands and possibly comprehensive reassessment of their career planning decisions. As the classroom emptied, Riley remained behind to ensure proper cleanup of educational materials and to verify that Instructor Kolos's medical emergency hadn't compromised the facility's learning environment. Her attention to administrative details suggested professional competence that extended beyond combat applications into areas of institutional responsibility and academic courtesy. The Academy's comfortable assumptions about species hierarchies, physical capabilities, and military effectiveness had undergone percussive recalibration, leaving behind an educational environment where previous certainties had been replaced by urgent questions requiring immediate research. The institution's 3-century tradition of confident instruction had encountered information that demanded comprehensive curriculum revision and possibly fundamental philosophical reassessment. And in the medical wing, Instructor Vex'tar Kolos was discovering that liquid nutrition provided excellent opportunity for reflection on the differences between theoretical knowledge and practical experience, particularly regarding the gap between assumed capabilities and demonstrated performance. His jaw would heal, his pride would recover, and his future lectures would undoubtedly incorporate greater appreciation for the distinction between appearing weak and actually being vulnerable. The Academy's purple towers continued reaching toward Nexus Prime's serene sky, though their symbolic significance had undergone adjustment that would require new interpretive frameworks and possibly updated promotional materials.